Okay, today we're going to talk about social stratification. This has been a long time since I posted a new video here. We're putting this up because of a special circumstance in where I'm not going to be in class this week. So this is chapter 7 in our video in class in TCI College in Manhattan. And talking about social stratification, you have to know what it is and why it's important. The truth of the matter is that once you know what it is, you'll know why it's important. It's pretty obvious. Our book calls it a classification of groups of people according to either shared socioeconomic conditions or inequalities in economic, social, political, ideological dimensions that affect life chances. Now, as usual, that's a long-winded, complex, hard to get your hands around definition that many sociology concepts have. So basically, it's some sort of systemic inequities, something that happens within the whole social system that makes a group of people, for some reason or another, right? That it could be a historic reason, it could be a social pressures, it could be well, actually, we have gender stratification also, but we'll talk about that in another chapter. But it could be gender or race or money or ethnicity or all sorts of things that might put people in a particular group. And because they're in their particular group, either intentionally or unintentionally, then it will affect the life chances of a person who falls into that group. Somebody who has an ascribed status by being in that particular group, it will affect their life chances. Life chances meaning that it will affect their chances of having a better life, having a worse life, getting into college, having a better job, marrying certain types of people, etc., etc. Now, of course, that these ideas can be varied. It could be things that happenstance. It could be because they're the way you were born. And in different societies, there's different ways of stratification. There are different possibilities. In general, there are actually two major systems in societies for stratification. The two major systems is caste and class. Now, we also have another one. We'll talk about a third one, which unfortunately still exists. But the basic ideas could be caste or class. Caste meaning that it is well, let's put it this way. Let's first talk about the differences between caste and class. Caste is something which is very, very rigid. It's different. It's impossible for somebody to move from one caste to another caste. If somebody was born, a caste means that somebody was born into a particular social position, social standing, and there's nothing that he or she can do in order to move herself out of that particular position. It's goes from generation to generation. The strictest caste system that we have had in modern times is the Indian caste system, which is illegal but still exists, and we'll talk about that. But the difference in a class system, which we have mostly in America in most places, and it's the type of system which is which most societies strive to attain, is that there is, as against the caste system, the class system has a possibility of mobility. Mobility means that you can move from one place to another. Mobile means movement. And of course, what's important here, they should have horizontal mobility, right? Where you go from one job to another this way, although you're not going up or down in your class. But you can have also a vertical mobility, vertical meaning up and down. The vertical is that you actually move up or down in your class. So in a class system, one of the most important hallmarks of a class system is the idea that a person can move up or down. A person born in a lower class can have an achieved status of a higher class. A person in a higher class can maybe even born into a wealthy family and have a ascribed status of a wealthy family, but still can lose all his wealth and all his money and all his power and all his prestige and wind down on a lower class and even become destitute. That has in a class system. Now, in a caste system, or in a strict or in a caste system of some sort, they can't. They can't change their mobility, their level. Okay. Today we see that there is in America, we have a great mobility on the individual level. On a statistical level, we have a problem. But on the individual level, certainly is, we see that there is people are able to change their status, going from one class to the other, regardless of gender and ethnicity and race. Doesn't make it easier, right? Certainly is difficult, but certainly we have that in America. The other another difference between the caste system and a class system, right, is the relative importance of the achieved and ascribed statuses. In a caste system, that ascribed status of where you are is way much more important. It determines how you are seen in every way, shape, manner, or form. If you are a royalty by birth, and you will stay royalty for the rest of your life, and that will affect how everybody views you and looks at you, no matter what happens. It's a master status in that sense. On the other hand, in a class system, okay, certainly that is important if one becomes wealthy and powerful and prestigious, but it is not of that same type of relative importance. A third factor that one might talk about in the comparison of a caste system to a class system is that the restrictions, the difference in the amount of restrictions put on people is not the same. In other words, in a caste system, generally speaking, the restrictions put on the lower class is way, way greater than the restrictions put in the lower class in a class system. Class system, by definition, has because it has more flexible mobility, it also gives people more of a chance to be mobile, and which means, like for instance, in the strict caste systems that we have, be it again, we'll take India, but there's other places in the world also, the lower classes do not get a chance to get education. Pakistan and rural Pakistan, in various third world countries in the Middle East, there is a lack of opportunity for the people of some sort of lower class which they were born into, and they don't have the possibility of getting out of having education, access to health, access to good housing, sometimes access to food. And the basic idea there is because if they are of the disempowered class, or they're disempowered caste, then they are, and there's a limited amount of resources, it's those groups or castes that have more power that will be able to take the resources for themselves, and those other people are of a less worthy of having that. Of course, this is the problem with the caste system, because how could you say they're less worthy? Nonetheless, this is the basic difference that we can have between the caste system and the class system. One of the ways, by the way, that we actually, if you go, the Americans who try to, and Westerners who try to alleviate some of these systems, one of the things they try to do is to put in educational systems, empower the poor people by making sure they have education. Once they have education, then it's easier for a person to to continue. So that would be the issues with the caste system versus the class system. I would like to talk a little about the caste system in India, because again, that's the most prevalent one. It's been illegal since 1947. Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, who was the revolutionary, nonviolent activist and politician and statesman, who got the British rule off of India, founding the largest democracy in the world. Although the problem there was that for 3,000 years they've had a system, a societal system of castes. Basically, 4 castes. I don't remember all of them. Brahmins is the top, Dalit is the bottom. The top caste are the priestly class. They were the ones with the most power. The second was the warrior and ruler class. The third is the merchant class, and the fourth is the worker class. And then underneath the worker class is the Dalit, and the Dalit were typically known in the Western world as the untouchables. Until this day, in India, these, especially in rural India, in the cities, people don't necessarily understand that it's still going on within the rural states in India. India has over 200 states in the whole subcontinent country of India. And in the rural areas, and as typically as we know from history, rural areas change a lot slower. If we go down to the rural South and small towns in the South, we still have 1950s prejudice over there. Something that people here in the New York metropolitan area, if we grew up here, we don't even understand necessarily that such a thing can still exist. Well, the same thing is parallel in India, but in some way, even in many ways, a lot worse, because their caste system has been around for 3,000 years, and the difference and the type of behaviors and work that was going on in their system, which kept society very well organized, was fantastically rigid. You have the lowest caste of the Indian culture, the untouchables, had the lowest types of jobs. And if you were born into a family that had a particular job, that is a job you're going to die with, and that's a job that your children are going to have. And it doesn't make a difference if you were in a merchant class or a merchant caste. I keep saying class, but it's caste. A merchant caste where you were selling furniture. Then you're going to sell furniture when you grow up. If you were a priest, then you were going, and your parents were priests, you were going to be a priest. But if you're even on the untouchable level, and your job was cleaning out the latrines, you are going to clean out the latrines for the rest of your life. And normally that was done with your bare hands, and it was done, etc. And it's still to this day, we have people who have to work in that type of things. And they don't get food, they don't get medical insurance, they don't get medical care, they don't get housing, because there is, a matter of fact, even if they're walking down the street and there are Brahmins or much higher caste standing there, they have to take off their shoes in order to walk by until they get to their own place of residence. They're not allowed to walk with their shoes on in the presence of the upper castes. Sometimes in the little bit more integrated towns, because the untouchables were on such an impure level that even if their shadow was to pass over somebody of a higher caste, that person would have to go and get ritually purified, which means the people of the untouchable castes were not to go out when there's long shadows, because they might impurify the other people. So, and this is something which goes on from generation to generation to generation. Practically a type of slavery. They certainly can be used as slaves. Not too long ago, there was an uprising of some of these untouchables in one of the rural provinces of India. I think about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and the merchant class or another caste went out and quelled the uprising, killing 22 of them. And of course, it was well known and obvious and accepted that these poor souls brought it on themselves. They didn't have guns, but whatever. And that is the idea that we have in the caste system. As against that, we have actually what we have in the Western society today. Now, there was a caste system, by the way, in Europe, for instance. In the Middle Ages, there was aristocracy, the royalty, the aristocracy, the merchants, and the peasants. And if you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. There was economic reasons why they went, and we're not going into the details of it, but that was actually, for some time in the Western world, there was a caste system. Today, there's not well, before I actually get to the caste system, the class system, actually, I want to say a few words about one more type of social stratification, which used to be extremely prevalent, and it's not quite as strict as the caste system, but it's much more strict than our class system, and that's the idea of slavery. Now, you think slavery is probably the worst thing you can think of, okay? But in fact, slavery was something that people could be bought into and bought out of. In a caste system, there's nothing you can do, right? A slave slavery has been around for as long as human beings have had societies. It was a major source of labor for most traditional societies. People became slaves for many reasons. And slavery was not always the way we necessarily think of it or the way it is today. There were, in ancient Greece, for instance, slaves were able to have any sort of profession, and they were able to own money, but they were still subservient to their masters. There was times when people would sell themselves into slavery because it was a choice of either I will be completely given over to somebody else to work at their will, or I will starve. Well, not much of a choice, right? I'm willing to work the rest of my life, and so as long as I'll have a life more than 4 or 5 days, or maybe a month or two. I don't know how long it takes for somebody who's starving to dissipate, but I don't even want to think about that one. Many societies looked for slaves, and that's why we had slave trade, certainly like we had in the Transatlantic slave trade. But prior to that, many societies looked for slaves, and the reason why they looked for slaves is because they needed slave labor. It's a cheap labor. They would go out and have wars for the specific purpose of getting more laborers for their own homes. So there was actually two reasons why somebody would become a slave, either because it was a safe way for me to be safe, right? I was under the auspices of somebody else, but I didn't have to worry about food and board and living. I could actually live. I have a skill that's good for so-and-so. I'm a great carpenter. I make great tables, but economy is bad. I can't even buy wood. My family is starving. You know what? I'll sell myself as a carpenter for a rich family, and I'll live my life. Okay. In other words, it makes sort of sense. But if that was the case, then somebody's want to make. He's actually buying a capital investment that he wants to take care of. Of course, that doesn't mean it was always like that. There was, and like when you take like the POWs, the prisoner of wars who were taken as slaves. Take the Roman galleys. They were in the ships of Rome. They were powered by slave labor, and the slave laborers who were rowing the boats, right? They rowing the boats for 8 hours a day, right? In warships, they were rowing the boats. They didn't get much to eat, and they were like, most of the slaves were still slaves the way we think of it today. Today, actually, slavery is still exists. It exists in most parts of the world. There's only 2 countries that we know that there are no slavery. That's Greenland and Iceland. Slaves can be bought. The problem today with slaves, and this you can look on a TED.com lecture that you could find there on slavery. You can search slavery and you'll find this lecture, that tells about what the slave industry is like today. There's 27 million slaves in the world today. It sounds like a huge amount of numbers, but percentage-wise, it's very, very low. There's $40 billion worth of economy in the world economy. That's a very small amount. Slavery, the problem today with slavery is that you can buy slaves really, really cheap today because of the market, right? Whatever it is, slaves can be bought in some parts of the world for as little as $5. And when you think about it, $5 for a fisherman, right? For a slave boy fisherman, $5, right? how valuable, money-wise, how valuable is that? Not very much. So you get you work as much as you can, and then it doesn't work. It's like he says there. It's like a styrofoam cup. You finish, and you throw it away. There's no need for it. The slaves. That's the most expensive place where you can is the United States, where you can buy a slave for up to $8,000. It's an amazing sort of thing that it even exists. But since it's a small part of the economy, and since it's not really percentage-wise a huge amount, and because they're very cheap, truth of the matter is would only take, according to this particular lecture, $10.8 billion to emancipate and rehabilitate all the slaves in the world. Now that is not really a lot of money on a global scale. It's certainly not enough money for the United States government. It's something that really has to be looked into, and I would be really happy if somebody, in the sound of my voice, works on that, especially if somebody in my class would want to work on that. And you can always get in touch with me, and I'll show you how. Or you can go on TED.com and look for slavery and listen to the lecture and get in touch with the organization. Works fine. Okay, the third system, the third way of stratification, which is the major way of stratification in the world today, and that's the class system. As I mentioned before, the difference between a caste and a class is that we have more mobility. That doesn't mean that it's completely mobile. On a statistical level, it's not. These seems to be really, really strict. A little bit of history. The class system became strongly structured with the Industrial Revolution. At that point, without the legal constraints of companies, they became great industrialists, became the wealthiest people that ever lived in the world were the great industrialists of the Industrial Revolution. People like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, others became fantastically wealthy. In the height of the Industrial Revolution, as I've mentioned before, the disparity between the wealthy and the poor was fantastic. It was somewhat similar, reminiscent to the disparity between the wealthy and the poor in France prior to the French Revolution. And that led Karl Marx to develop his ideas that he published in the Communist Manifesto, or in his book Das Kapital, where he talked about what is the capitalist system and why it is doomed for failure. He got it a little bit wrong, but his contributions to economic thought and sociological thought were tremendous. Probably because, of course, that he was actually an economist. He wasn't really a historian. He certainly wasn't a sociologist. He was an economist. And he looked at the difference in class based on basically one factor. The factor that he had as the basic idea was that whoever owned the resources, sources of production, the means of production, that was the one class. The other class were those who did not have power and were able to control the means of production. When you think of it, what does it mean? When a class of people or a person has control over the means of production, the means of production means he has a factory. The means of production means he owns the material, he owns the land or the machinery in order to produce whatever it is you want to produce, right? So if you want to produce clothing, you want to produce hardware, you want to produce anything, right? There is a place where it's being produced. Excuse me, and that is somebody has to own that. If that's whoever owns that, that is the person who owns the means of production. And those are either called a capitalist, one word, a capitalist, or in his words, the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is a French word meaning, meaning, at least as far as we're concerned, those people who own the means of production. Now, what about everybody else? Where did everybody else fit in? Well, if you don't own the means of production, you still have to feed your family, right? If you don't own a factory, you still have to feed your family. You don't own anything. You own your clothes. You own the table. You own whatever food you have. It doesn't last very long because you're eating it. You're not producing anything. Well, how are you going to make money? You have your hands, right? And you can use your hands to sell your labor. If you sell your labor, then you're the proletariat or the working class, right? It's either, there's two words, again, just like capitalist and bourgeoisie, and for those are the wealthier means of production people, and the other people need to sell their labor. And they sell their labor to the bourgeoisie. They sell the labor to the capitalist. They are the laborers, the workers, or the proletariat. Okay? And these are the two classes that Marx saw in constant conflict one with the other. Very simple reason why. Right? They're in constant conflict because the people who own the factories are trying to make as much money as possible. One way of reducing the costs and therefore increasing profits is by getting as much work out of the laborers for at least amount of pay. Because if you pay the people less, then your profit is more, because there's a bigger gap between how much you're spending and how much you are selling your product for. And seeing as this is an intrinsic and irrevocable and undeniable conflict, there will always be a conflict, according to Marx. He had this. Well, another part of that is that, for instance, he said that you can only squeeze a certain amount. So he says, because you can only squeeze a certain amount out of a human being, right? Sooner or later, you're going to get a similar situation that you had in France before the revolution, where the proletariat and the workers are going to revolt and take over the means of production, and then you're going to have a socialist state because the means of production will be owned by the people. That never worked out quite that way for a number of factors. Amongst them, amongst the factors is that it's not true. We don't have only 24 hours in a day, right? That's one factor, because today we could squeeze a lot more work out of a lot less people, right? The other thing is that during the course of time, there became a lot of rules and regulations, and it's certainly from the advent of the labor unions and pushing governments to make rules so that there is not that much usurpation, not that much of a taking advantage of the workers as Marx had envisioned would eventually be. Now, besides those two, okay, Marx also later on added on a third class, right, which he called the Finance Aristocracy, because there always seems to be some group of people who they own factories, they're not running businesses, and they're not selling their labor. They're selling money, right? The people on Wall Street, for instance. He seemed to leave out the politicians. I wonder why. I'm sure, but maybe they would be called also like the finance aristocracy in his greater picture. Because those are people who actually sit back and just move the money around, and they take a profit from it, and they're not really producing anything. They're not producing any goods or services, and they're not using their hands and producing. They're not having factories. Nothing really comes out of that. So that's sort of like a politician. They don't produce anything either. They don't produce wealth. They just move it around. They take it in taxes. So that was basically Marx's idea of social class. The two being, now these two ideas, by the way, is extremely important for us to understand and to remember. And the reason being is because until today, especially in the United States, we talk about this class warfare. We talk about a conflict, a conflict between the upper class and the middle class and the lower class. Well, the lower class is not really talked about so much. It's also mostly the middle class and the upper class, the 1%ers and the 99%ers. And this is something which goes on all the time. So that is actually some extremely important ideas. That we talk about until today, especially this year when we're talking about presidential elections. There's going to be a lot of talk about class and class warfare. We had that in the last elections. The middle class because the middle class are the voting class. I mean, you want to talk about the people who really vote, that's mostly the middle class. The upper class is not, it doesn't have that many people in it. It's a very small percentage. And the lower class, unfortunately, don't really vote as much. They feel like they're not going to do anything. So it's the middle class that is always addressed to by the politicians. I don't think they really do so much for the middle class. I haven't seen anything change. And statistically speaking, the middle class gets smaller and smaller, which means that the politicians can talk. In all sides, I'm not talking anything, well, left or right. Both sides talk about it. And interestingly, the second, although there are quite a number of theorists as far as class is concerned, the second important one for us is Weber. And he talked about social class, basically talked about it positively or negatively, privileged property class. Not necessarily only about the means of production. He talked more about wealth. He talked about social status. He talked about power, and these things sort of work together. If you the power and social status come together as well as the wealth. Don't forget that wealth doesn't mean only money. Wealth means the entire amount of goods and services that a person can have. So that if you take somebody and they interact. Sometimes, let's take for instance a fellow like Colin Powell. Remember Colin Powell? He was a general. He was an army fellow, and that gave him a certain amount of power, or certainly, and he became popular and became popular in the general public. So he had a social status also, and that social status gave him I actually put him into be the cabinet member for George Bush, and gave him a lot of power. It increased his power actually, and gave him also a possibility of being wealthier, because he became, that power became enhanced his wealth. And this is the type of thing that Weber would say that this changes his class. He came from immigrant parents, and all that worked sort of to his benefit. So we see that there is all these differentiations, and a lot of these differentiations we're going to talk about in further classes when you talk about this. Stratification can be from ethnicity or for gender. They can work in education. It can work in many different ways. But why does it happen? What is good is it for? Why does it help the society? In other words, why do we have to always have a upper class, a middle class, and a lower class? That is the question that is asked by the sociologist of a functionalist perspective. And it's something which needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed. In particular, we'd like to know what are the possibilities. What do we talk about when we talk about the functionalist? I can mention a whole bunch of reasons why somebody would get a better job as against a lower job. Why is it helpful? Well, we need doctors, we need lawyers, we need airplane pilots, we need warriors, we need all sorts of things. Do we need warriors? Yeah, we need warriors. So certain positions in any society are functionally more important. Right? Think how important a doctor is in our society. And there's only a few, not everybody can be doctors, not everybody can be politicians. Only a certain amount of people can do that. Okay? So they have to be trained with the skills in order to be able to get this. And I think, how long does it take to become a doctor? Quite a lot of time and effort and money. Okay? So it means to become a specialist, such as a doctor, a heart surgeon, right? It takes a huge amount of training, right? And so in order to attract the talented people to these positions which take a lot more talent, right? They have to be able to give them more power and prestige so they will feel it's worthwhile putting in the time and money and effort. Why would you do something if you're not, if it takes you 17 years to become it takes you 7 extra postgraduate years to become a cobbler, to become a shoemaker, right? And you don't get any prestige or money for it, well, it's not going to be worthwhile. Very few people would want to do that. So be able to give it back. So there's that will give these people, of course, they'll give them, that society wants to give differential access to different people, and different esteem for the different people. Okay, that's how the stratification comes by. So because they have the power and because they've worked on it and they're contributing more to the society, then that's why they have to they have a differential status. Okay, so the social inequality among the different strata of the stratification, right, is there because, like even in the caste system, there's still only a certain amount of goods and services in the society, and they have to be distributed, and they're distributed at a higher level to the people of higher stratification because they put in so much more, and they're more qualified in certain ways than other people. Okay, now on the other hand, what's good? What about the other people? What about the people who are lower down on the sort of the middle class or the lower class, right? And the underclasses, we need them also because who else is going to fill those unskilled and dangerous jobs? Who's going to be a fisherman, right? The fisherman, by the way, is the most dangerous job in America. Did you know that? Yeah, it's the most dangerous job in America. The more people are killed being fishermen than any other job, but somebody has to do it. Right? We all like to eat fish, and it's healthy, and et cetera, and they're not all done in fish hatcheries. I love saying that word, fish hatcheries. And people need to be garbage collectors. People need to be nannies. People need to be dog walkers. I mean, that's part of it. It's, and in order for all these things to be done, that we need, if we go out and get a hamburger, right? You need somebody who's going to flip burgers. Well, you don't want to spend $12 for a burger. If you don't want to spend $12 for a burger, you'd have to get cheap labor. So you need a class of people, and that we all enjoy that. It's not like, the people who don't have a lot of money also need the services which aren't costing much. In order to do that, you have to have cheaper labor. If you don't have cheaper labor, the society is not going to function. Okay, the middle class itself, which is not the upper class, the middle class, right? It sustains the organizations because they are helpful and it provides. If they provide the employees that service the poor. If there's very poor people, you need some of this middle class is going to be servicing both the upper class and the lower class. Right? So it's not like they're just taking care of themselves. They're taking care of the whole society. Right, and so and another thing is that because society needs things, and then it comes at not needing things, there are services and goods that nobody wants. So instead of them being thrown away, it's recycled by the poor people, and they actually buy it. So, and this, by the way, works even better when you look at it from a global perspective, because many of our goods and services, you go YouTube anything that shows something that shows people in third world countries, and look at the clothes they're wearing. Right? If you notice, they're wearing clothes that come from America, clothes that our kids wore, and that's exactly what it is. Things that are not consumed by us are sent overseas to the people who don't use it anymore. So the poorer countries will get a chance to take up our goods. Instead of just throwing it away, they buy it. It's better than being thrown away. If you're going to sell something which is, if you have a shirt which is going to cost you $12 in the store, but nobody's buying it, right? So you can try to resell it for $3. Somebody might buy it. But what about that? They're not even going to buy that. So you can sell it for 50 cents or 10 cents on bulk, right? You sell, because you have a lot of them, you sell for $100. You sell the whole bulk for $100 to someplace in a third world, in Africa or South Asia or something like that, where people get the clothes or recycled instead of being thrown away. The same thing with the computers. Same thing with food and very interestingly, the same thing with tobacco, where we're still producing it, but we send it to third world countries where they can smoke the tobacco and maybe learn something about that we haven't learned. Okay, so that's this sort of stratification. Of course, not only goes in our country, it goes on a global level also. That's the functionalist perspective. The other side of that is, of course, the conflict perspective, which goes back to Marx, right? The conflict theorists, because we mentioned Marx, the conflict theorists don't believe that it's the most deserving people who get the best jobs. It's the upper class is in some way or another holding onto the situation in order they can, for their own families, keep the same jobs, right? And the lower class stays the way they are. Now, we have a lot of this going on in the United States from every generation. And it is, generally speaking, who gets the better jobs? How do you get a better job? Well, you'll get a better job, generally speaking, because you've got connections, because your family is there. If you have the single greatest factor of stratification, education, higher education, if you're wealthy, you're likely to go to good school. You'll be able to pay the $40,000 a year in order to get into a good school. If you're super wealthy and you give an endowment to Yale or Harvard or something like that, well, why wouldn't your kids go there? After all, your parents did, and your grandparents did, and your great-grandparents did, so of course you'll be going to Yale, right? The Bushes and have gone there, and the Roosevelts have gone there for generations, right? Many of these families have done that. So that's one way. But even the middle class stays the middle class. People get their jobs because they have the connections. So you've got an idea here that the class keeps the class, and the class stays where they are from generation to generation. Truth of the matter is that it's not 100%. The percentages of people in each class seems to be the same, but because of that mobility, which we started off talking about, every individual in the United States can move up and down, and people do move up and down. You look at the statistics. I don't have them in front of me right now, but there is quite a lot of vertical mobility. But as a class, we want to make sure, if we have the money, we want to make sure that our kids will get the good schools. So we have a system where the property taxes go into the local schools, in most places in the United States. So where you have a wealthier property taxes, you'll have wealthier schools. So they will get better education, and they will keep that middle class as against the inner cities, where they have less property taxes and they will have less money for the schools, and therefore the children will get a lesser education, and they will be more difficult for them to move up in their social class. The other thing is that class, by definition, has an inequality, and if you look at it, the inequality, that seems to be quite an exaggeration in the amount of inequality. That's something which we'd like to sort of look at. There are many factors, which have to do with the jobs: family, gender, ethnicity, etc. But the gap between the upper and middle class and lower classes, it's not really proportional. There's something amiss there. For instance, in 1979, an entry level, if you jump middle class, right? The entry level middle class job, right, was in 1979. It was 37% higher than entry level. I don't know if I said that right. And if a college graduate finishing school in 1979 was able to get an entry level job which had 37% better wages than somebody who is not a college graduate. 37%. Okay, well, that makes sense, except that when you think about over the years, how has that changed? In 2005, the gap was 104%, more than twice as much better. Okay, from 1/3 better to more than twice as much better. Okay, that's an amazing change. So there's good parts of that. More people are looking to get it. It's more important to get a college education, as most of our students know. It makes a difference. More people need to get a college education. It also makes a college education generally less valuable, because today a college graduate will get the same sort of job as in 1960 a high school graduate would get in 1950s. So there's a lot of here also give and play, give and take. In 2007, right, the median net worth of the top 10% of the population was $1,119,000, and the median net worth of the lowest was about $8,100. So as a group, the rich seem to be getting richer, and the poor seem to be getting poorer. So the class differentiation, as groups go, as time goes on, seems to be getting greater and greater. Of course, it's not as great as it was in the times of the Industrial Revolution. The wealthiest people are not as are wealthier than the wealthiest people today, and the poor people are not as poor today as they were then. But in dollar wise, it seems to be that way. Absolutely. Let's see. I think that's just about all I have to say for today. Okay. Just to go over this, we talked about with social stratification, a definition of social stratification. We talked about the difference between caste and class. We talked about described caste. We talked a little about slavery and how that's changed. We talked about the difference in classes according to Marx. We talked about the factors according to Weber. And we talked about the functionalist perspective. We talked about the conflict, and we talked about the conflict perspective in social stratification. Thank you.